The seat had been empty for 1,000 years. It sat at the back of the Grand Assembly Chamber on Vellhari Prime, carved from black stone that no living species could identify, etched with symbols that the Vellhari archivists had spent 2 centuries trying to read. The closest they ever got was a single word. Earth. The seat was built for one kind of body: 2 legs, 2 arms, soft skin, no carapace, no extra limbs, no bioluminescent ridge or secondary jaw. A body that was, by the galaxy's general standards, embarrassingly fragile. And in the 997 formal sessions, held since that body's last appearance in this chamber, the seat had never been filled. Nobody moved it. This was not sentiment. The 3 great empires that ran the galaxy had no use for sentiment. The seat stayed because removing it required a formal motion. A formal motion required a debate, and no empire wanted to be the one that officially declared humanity dead. Dead things could not return and demand answers. Missing things were a different problem entirely. So the seat stayed, and the galaxy went on without the species that had once sat in it. Senator Var of the Dorathi had looked at that seat in every session he had attended for 40 years. He was old. Not ancient by Dorathi standards, but old enough that his 3 eyes were clouding at the edges, and his 6 fingers had developed the permanent curve of someone who had spent too long gripping things in cold transport ships. He represented the Remnant Assembly, which was the polite name for the 11 species crammed into the corner of the galaxy that the Keth Dominion had not yet gotten around to eating. Today's session was about trade routes. It was always about trade routes, or territorial boundaries, or resource rights, all of which were different words for the same conversation, which was, who owned what and who would die trying to take it back. Grand Executor Heth of the Keth Dominion stood at the center of the chamber floor. The Keth did not sit. They had 6 legs and had spent their entire evolutionary history at the top of their food chain. And resting was something they considered a design flaw in weaker species. Heth's carapace was deep blue-black, which among his people indicated the kind of status that did not need to announce itself. He was explaining, in precise detail, why the Morn Trade Corridor had been under Keth administrative authority for the past 3 years, and why the Assembly's objections were noted and irrelevant. Var stopped listening to the words around the same time he had learned to stop listening to Heth's words, which was approximately 600 sessions ago. He listened to the tone instead, the rhythm, the way the other delegates held their bodies. High Arbiter Celis of the Vellhari Conclave sat perfectly still, her secondary eyelids half closed, which Var had learned meant she was working hard to look like she felt nothing. The Morn trade delegates sat in a cluster, their tentacles moving in the slow patterns of intensive calculation. Everyone was performing. The Grand Assembly had become a theater where the script was written in advance, and the only question left was who lost how much this decade. The Remnant Assembly tier was quiet. 11 species, 140 delegates. Some of them were civilizations older than both the Keth and the Vellhari. None of them had much power left. Var looked at the empty seat. He was still looking at it when his communicator vibrated against his thigh. His aide knew better. 12 years, and Pell had never interrupted a session floor appearance. Var left it. It vibrated again. He checked it under the table edge, careful and fast. 3 words. Earth frequency signal detected. He read them. He read them a second time. He put the communicator away. He sat very still. Up at the front of the chamber, Heth continued speaking, mapping ownership of things that belonged to other people. And the lights were bright and steady. And 300 delegates went through the motions of civilization. And Var sat in the middle of all of it, and felt something shift in his chest. It took him a moment to identify it. Hope. He had not felt that particular thing in a long time. The session ended an hour later. He found an empty alcove in the corridor outside, closed the door and called Pell. "Tell me everything," he said. She read him the message from Chief Observer Mara at the Dorathi Outer Rim Observatory. The signal, the coordinates, the frequency match, the fact that it was broadcasting at precise 6-hour intervals. "She says she's working on decoding it," Pell said. "Book me transport to the Outer Rim." A pause. "Senator, the water rights petition is in 4 days. Book the transport." He closed the call. In his coat pocket was a photograph his grandmother had given him. Physical paper, laminated to survive the decades. A Dorathi village before the 3rd Keth expansion burned it. His grandmother, young and laughing. And beside her, grinning in the wide, slightly awkward way of people who were far from home and happy about it anyway. 2 humans. Aid workers. They had come after a drought. They had stayed for 2 years. They had become, according to his grandmother, among the finest people she had ever known. She had died waiting for them to come back. He did not take out the photograph. He walked to the transport bay with the careful posture of a man trying very hard not to run. Chief Observer Mara ran the Outer Rim Observatory on 3 functional dishes, a staff of 7, and a maintenance budget that her predecessor had called an insult delivered with paperwork. She had been there 11 years. She checked the Earth coordinates every quarter because a note in the database said to, and she had never found anything, and she had expected to retire finding nothing. She was on the far side of the building with a hand torch when the signal came in. 2 of her dishes were degraded by a dust storm. The automated alert had been broken for 3 months. Her junior technician, Lorne, was alone in the monitoring room when the line appeared in the data. A frequency from a communication band that nothing in the current galaxy used. Pre-departure human standard. Old enough to be from a museum. Fresh enough to have come in 6 minutes ago. She came in from the storm, red dust on her coat, and looked at his screen. She ran interference corrections. She checked calibration. She verified the source coordinates 4 times. She sat down. "What do we do?" Lorne asked. "We tell Senator Var," she said. "We tell nobody else until we know who already knows." She sent the message and turned back to the data. 18 hours later, she had a partial decode. It was not a distress signal. It was not military. It was navigational. Approach vectors, safe routes. Every path marked with hazard designations in pre-departure human notation. An invitation. One that assumed someone would still be interested in coming. She put the full data on a sealed local drive, took it off the connected network, and locked it in her desk. She was not paranoid. She had just spent 11 years working in the part of the galaxy where the Keth operated, and she had learned the difference between paranoia and paying attention. The Keth intelligence network found out about the signal 72 hours later. This was slower than usual. The Dorothi network had very little worth monitoring, and the encrypted traffic from a backwater observatory had taken a junior analyst an extra day to flag. When the report landed on Heth's desk, he was reviewing the Morn corridor consolidation plans. He set those plans aside and read the report 3 times. Then he called Sect, his senior military advisor. She had served him for 61 years and was still alive because she told him the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. "Assessment," he said. "Unknown threat level," Sect said. They were young when they left. No significant military infrastructure on record. "They were young 1,000 years ago," Heth said. "We do not know what they have been doing since." "No, we do not," his carapace shifted. "Send a diplomatic courier. Establish contact. Learn what we are working with." Sect nodded. The order was out before she left the room. 3 days after the first signal, a new message came from the Earth coordinates. This one used the standard galactic communication band. Every translation unit in the known galaxy read it clean. "Hello, it has been a while. We are coming out. We come in peace and in strength, and we hope to see old friends. We know there are those who will find our return inconvenient. We understand this. We ask only that you consider one thing. We left so that we could become something worth coming back as. We believe we have done that. We look forward to the conversation." 6 hours of silence. Precise, deliberate silence, and then very simply, "To the remnant assembly, we have not forgotten. We will never forget." On a transport crossing the outer rim, Senator Var read this message 4 times. He sat in his seat and looked out at the stars and did not speak for a long time. The stars looked the same as they had always looked. They had no idea what was coming. Neither did the galaxy. Var reached into his coat pocket and held the laminated photograph against his palm, not looking at it. His grandmother's voice, gentle and completely certain. "They'll come back, little one." He had been waiting 40 years to find out if she was right. It turned out the answer was yes. The Vellhari conclave received the message at the same time as everyone else. High Arbiter Silas read it in her private chamber, alone, in the kind of silence that high-ranking Vellhari cultivated around themselves the way other species cultivated gardens. She read it twice. She set it down on her desk. She was the most powerful psychic in the conclave, which meant she was one of the most powerful psychics in the known galaxy. And she had the particular skill of being able to feel the emotional content of words even in translation. She felt nothing from this message, not blankness. Blankness was something she could read. This was different. This was a wall so smooth there was nothing to grip. She had never encountered a communication that felt like that. She sat with that fact for a long time. Then she called her Security Council and told them to begin compiling everything the Conclave archives held on human psychology, human history, and human methods of warfare. She told them she needed it in 24 hours. They had it in 36. It was very thin. Sisis looked at the thin file and thought about walls with nothing to grip, and thought about 1,000 years of unobserved development, and felt the first edges of something she very rarely felt. She was careful. She kept her face exactly as it always was, but she was careful. Part 2, the station called Crosspoint had been neutral territory for 200 years, which in practical terms meant it was so thoroughly monitored by all three empires simultaneously that nobody could do anything there without everyone else finding out immediately. It sat at the intersection of four major transit lanes and had a population of roughly 80,000 from 60 different species, and its primary economic activity was information. Buying it, selling it, sitting on it, and occasionally losing it to people who were better at the business of knowing things. It was the most logical place for a first meeting. The human ship came out of transit on a clear morning by station time, which meant the observation decks were full. Every species on Crosspoint had a different way of dealing with things they did not understand. The Keth diplomatic courier that had arrived 6 hours earlier sent an immediate encrypted report. The Morn information brokers pulled out their recording equipment. The handful of remnant assembly civilians who lived in the station's lower districts pressed against the observation windows with an intensity that made the station security officers nervous. The ship was not what anyone expected. It was not large, which was the first surprise. A warship establishing dominance comes in big, and comes in loud and makes sure everyone understands what they are looking at. This ship was medium-sized, elegant in the way of something built without compromise, every surface doing exactly what it needed to do and nothing else. No decorative armor, no aggressive geometry. It moved through the docking approach with a precision that made experienced pilots on the observation deck go quiet and watch more carefully, because the control implied by that kind of movement was not something you saw in a ship operated by an ordinary crew. It docked without a single correction burn. The airlock opened. 3 people walked out. They looked, to most of the species present, like nothing special at all. 2 legs, 2 arms, no armor, no visible weapons. They were wearing plain dark clothing that could have meant anything. 2 of them were clearly security, positioned correctly, alert in the right ways, the kind of alert that did not announce itself. The third was a woman in her middle years. Brown skin, gray-streaked dark hair pulled back, moving the way some people move when they have reached the stage of life where they no longer feel the need to perform anything for anyone. She stopped in the center of the docking bay and looked around at the crowd that had gathered. Station officials, Keth diplomatic staff, Morn brokers, the general chaos of Crosspoint's curious population. And she took it all in with an expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else, and said, in clear standard galactic that needed no translation unit, "Hello." She said it the way you say hello to someone you have been looking forward to seeing. Her name was Commander Yara Reyes, and she was Earth's representative, and she had not slept in 22 hours, and none of that showed in her face or her voice, or the way she stood. The station administrator, a Morn named Pelax, who had been doing this job for 30 years and thought he had seen everything worth seeing, got to her first on the grounds that it was technically his station. "Commander Reyes," he said, and his translation unit put it into standard. "Welcome to Crosspoint. We were not certain what to expect." "That's fair," she said. "We haven't been around in a while." She looked at him with the kind of direct attention that Morn found slightly unsettling. They processed eye contact differently, and said, "Is there somewhere we can talk? I imagine there's a lot of ground to cover." There was. Pellix led them to the station's official meeting rooms, which he had spent the last 6 hours upgrading with every security measure Crosspoint had, which he was now fairly sure had been a waste of time. The woman did not feel dangerous. She felt calm. She felt calm in a way that the very powerful often feel calm, which was itself its own kind of message. The Keth diplomatic courier's name was Sub-Executor Vren. He was there when they arrived in the meeting room, which was not how Pellix had arranged it, but which was also not surprising, because the Keth were good at being places they had not been invited. Vren did what Keth diplomats did. He established size and position immediately, took the largest chair at the table's head, and looked at Reyes with a particular expression of someone who was calculating something. "The Keth Dominion welcomes the return of the human species," he said. "Grand Executor Heth has asked me to convey his personal interest in establishing a productive relationship." "Tell him thank you," Reyes said. She sat down, not at the foot of the table, in the middle, at the side, where she could see everyone. "I'd be happy to meet with him directly at some point. There's a lot to discuss." "The Grand Executor is interested in your development during the period of absence," Vren said. "He hopes you'll understand that the current galactic order has certain established facts," Ray said. "Yes, we're aware." She picked up the cup of water that had been placed at her seat, looked at it for a moment, put it down. "We've been watching." Vren's carapace shifted. "Watching? We left, Sub-Executor. We didn't go blind." She said it simply, without heat. We know what the galaxy looks like now. We know what happened to a lot of the species that were here when we left. We know about the 3 expansion waves and the consolidation acts, and what the current composition of the remnant assembly is. She paused. We know about the Sarathi clearance, the Darathi third reduction, the Pelion relocation. The room was very quiet. We have been watching for a long time, she said. We did not speak because we were not ready. We are ready now. Vren was quiet for a moment. Then, ready for what, precisely? That, Reyes said, is the conversation. Senator Var arrived at Crosspoint 14 hours after Reyes's ship docked. He was moving faster than dignity suggested he should be, and he knew it, and he did not care. He had spent 14 hours on a fast transport reading everything his office had compiled about the signal, the ship, the limited information coming out of Crosspoint about the meeting in progress, and the decoded navigation vectors from the observatory, which he had memorized as if memorizing them would speed up the transit somehow. The Crosspoint Station security officer, who met him at the docking bay, was a young Darathi woman who was trying very hard to look professional and was having some difficulty because she had clearly just been crying. Senator Var, she said, Commander Reyes's team left a message for your arrival. She handed him a physical note, paper. He had not seen physical paper in decades. He opened it. It said, Senator, we would very much like to see you. Room 7, second level. Take your time, we'll be here. Reyes. He did not take his time. She was alone in the room when he arrived. Her 2 security personnel were outside the door. She was sitting with her hands around a fresh cup of something hot. And when he walked in, she looked up and looked at him the way people look at someone they have been told about. Studied the way you study something important. She stood. She extended her hand. He knew enough human history to know what that meant. He took it. She shook it once, firm and brief. Senator Var, she said, I've read everything we have on your career. What you've done for the assembly and the conditions you've been working in. She paused. It's remarkable. Genuinely. He had been in politics for 40 years. He knew how people used compliments and how to recognize when one was real. This was real. He sat down across from her. Commander, he said, you'll understand that I have questions. I'd be worried if you didn't, she said. Where did you go? She looked at him steadily. Somewhere safe. Somewhere we could work. We found a way to fold a section of space that couldn't be seen from outside. We called it the between. She said it like it was simple, like folding space was the kind of thing you do when you need privacy, and the matter-of-fact delivery of that sentence made Var's mind go briefly to a strange place. We spent 1,000 years in there. 1,000 years, he said. We had a lot to figure out. She turned her cup between her hands. We saw what the galaxy was becoming before we left. We were young. We didn't have the tools yet to do anything about it, so we made a decision as a species to go and get the tools. He looked at her. That is a very long time to wait. We're patient, she said, when we need to be. It came out quiet. It was the quietest sentence in the room. It landed somewhere in Var's chest and stayed there. What are you going to do, he asked. She looked at him for a moment before answering. We're going to talk first, to everyone. We're going to make offers. We're going to give the current powers a chance to adjust. She said this evenly, without judgment, in the same tone you might use to explain a weather forecast. Some of them will take that chance. Some won't. And the ones who won't, she did not answer immediately. Outside the station windows, the stars were visible, the same stars that had been in the sky throughout all the centuries of the Empire's expansion, and the remnant assembly's slow shrinking and the endless theater of the Grand Assembly. We didn't spend 1,000 years building weapons, she said. That's what I need you to understand. We built a lot of other things. The weapons were just a small part. She looked at him directly. But we built those too. The Keth warship arrived at Crosspoint 6 hours later, not the diplomatic courier, a warship, escort class, the kind that typically escorted diplomats who had not been given a choice about the direction they were traveling. Var heard about it from Pell, who heard it from station security. He went to find Reyes. She was already on the observation deck, watching the warship approach, her arms crossed over her chest. They've sent an escort, Var said. I can see that. She watched the warship settle into the docking approach. It was 3 times the size of her ship. It moved with the particular weight of something that expected space to move out of its way. Are you concerned? He asked. She looked at the warship. Then she looked at him. Then she smiled. Not the large performed kind, just the small honest kind, and said no. She pulled out her communicator and sent a short message. He did not see what it said. 8 minutes later, 4 things happened in rapid sequence. The lights on the Keth warship went out. Every system on the warship shut down simultaneously. The warship hung in the dark for 6 seconds. Then everything came back on, and the warship sat very still, and the communications channel opened. The Keth captain's voice was not steady. "What did you do to my ship?" Ray's voice, into her communicator, was perfectly level. "We demonstrated something. Your ship is fine, nothing is damaged. We wanted to show you what a conversation looks like when it's with us." She paused. "Sub-Executor Vren is in room 6, second level. Please tell him we'd love to continue our discussion at his convenience." She put the communicator away and looked back at the stars. "Now," she said, to nobody in particular, "we'll see who wants to talk." Part 3. The Keth Dominion was not, by its own internal judgment, in the habit of being afraid. Grand Executor Heth spent 6 days receiving reports from Sub-Executor Vren before he decided that diplomacy had told him what diplomacy was going to tell him, which was not enough. The crosspoint incident with the warship was troubling in a way that he did not discuss openly with anyone. Because there were things you did not say out loud when you ran an empire. You did not say, "I don't understand what happened." You did not say, "I am uncertain how to proceed." You said, "Our assessment is incomplete and we are gathering additional data." He gathered additional data the Keth way. He sent 200 warships to the Earth coordinates. This was not subtle. He did not intend it to be subtle. Admiral Torn, who commanded the fleet, was given clear orders: go to Earth, assess the situation directly, and report back. Torn was experienced, careful, and not given to panic. He had run the 3rd and 5th expansion campaigns. He had pacified 11 contested systems. He was exactly the kind of officer you sent when you needed an accurate reading and not a nervous one. The fleet jumped. They came out of transit at the edge of Earth's solar system and ran full sensor sweeps for 2 hours before moving closer. The readings were strange. Earth's star was where it was supposed to be. The 8 planets were in their expected positions. The 3rd planet, Earth itself, was there, blue, green, and white clouded through the long-range optics, exactly as the historical files described it. Nothing else was where it was supposed to be. The historical files showed an empty system, no significant orbital infrastructure. A species that had just reached space travel would have a few stations, perhaps some preliminary development on nearby moons. That was expected for a young species. They had been young when they left. The sensors were reading orbital infrastructure around Earth that went from the upper atmosphere out past the 4th planet. Not stations. Something else. Dense, layered, precise. The readings came back as metal and composite material and energy signatures that the sensor AI flagged as unknown and kept flagging as unknown no matter how many times Torn ran the analysis. "Unknown how?" he asked his sensor chief. "Unknown as in it doesn't match anything in our database," the sensor chief said. "Not as in unclear. As in this isn't a category we have." Torn thought about that. Continue approach. Standard formation. They went slowly. He was careful. He followed the approach vectors from the human broadcast, the ones that had been labeled as safe routes, because ignoring labeled safe routes in an unknown system was not careful. At the halfway point, a message came in on the standard band. Calm. Unhurried. Speaking standard galactic clearly. "Admiral Torn, welcome. We have been watching your approach since you entered the system. We appreciate that you followed the safe vectors. Please continue on your current heading. We would like to talk." Torn stopped the fleet. He sat in his command chair for a long moment and thought about the fact that a human voice had just said his name in a system that had been empty for 1,000 years. "How did they know my name?" his intelligence officer said. Nobody answered. Torn sent a message back. "This is Admiral Torn of the Keth Dominion 1st Expansion Fleet. We are here on a diplomatic assessment. We request full disclosure of your current military capability and territorial claims." 6 seconds. Then, "Those are reasonable requests. We'll answer them in person. Please continue your approach to the designated coordinates." The designated coordinates appeared on his navigation display, a point in space approximately 60,000 kilometers above Earth's North Pole. Torn looked at those coordinates for a long time. "Proceed," he said. They moved in, slowly, 200 ships in full combat readiness, shields up, weapons charged but not deployed. The infrastructure readings got stranger as they closed the distance. The energy signatures were everywhere. Not in any pattern that a defensive grid would make. Not in any pattern that an offensive grid would make. In a pattern that didn't correspond to anything in Keth military doctrine. At 40,000 kilometers from Earth, Torn's fleet stopped. Not because he ordered it. Every ship in the fleet stopped simultaneously, engines running, no collision, no distress, just stopped, held. As if an enormous hand had placed itself in front of 200 warships and said, "Wait here a moment." Torn's communicator activated, the same voice, still calm. "Admiral, we don't want this to become something it doesn't need to be. We've stopped your fleet as a demonstration, not as an attack. Nothing on any of your ships is damaged. Nothing will be damaged. We want to show you something, and then we'd like to talk. Release my fleet, Torn said in a moment. Please look at your long-range sensors. He looked. Earth was changing, not the planet itself. What was changing was the space around it, the infrastructure, the unknown readings, the patterns that didn't match any category were moving, or resolving, or revealing themselves. The sensor AI stopped flagging them as unknown and started flagging them as something it had no word for, which it represented on the display as a solid gold overlay that covered everything from the upper atmosphere out past where the fleet was sitting. 200 Keth warships were inside something. They had been inside it for 47 minutes and had not known. We've had a long time to build, the voice said, and we've always been very good at building things. A pause. We're not going to hurt you. We want to be very clear about that. We don't want a war. We're going to release your fleet in a few minutes, and we'd like to invite you to send a representative to the surface. A conversation, Admiral. That's what we're asking for. Torn ran a diagnostic on every system on his ship. Everything operational, everything intact. 200 ships suspended in space inside, something that had built itself around them in an occupied system, and they had not detected it until it moved. He made a command decision, the kind that did not feel good but was correct. Respond, he said. Tell them we accept the invitation. One representative, me. He went down in a shuttle. Earth from the surface was blue sky and green trees and air that smelled like things that had no industrial processing in them. This was not what Torn had expected. He had been in 17 occupied systems, and they all had the particular quality of places that had been worked on. Earth did not have that quality. Earth had the quality of a place that had been worked on, and then allowed to come back to itself, and had. The woman who met him was Reyes. He knew her from the Crosspoint intelligence reports. She shook his hand. Keth did not have this gesture in their culture, but he had read enough about humans to allow it, and walked with him toward a building that looked, at first, like a modest administrative structure. It was not modest. Inside, it was an operations center that covered more ground than his flagship. Screens and displays and infrastructure that made his sensor chief's unknown category problem make a little more sense because you could not categorize things that were genuinely new. We have 342 orbital installations, Rhea said, walking beside him as if she were giving him a tour of something she was quietly proud of. 4 deep stations beyond the outer planets. We've fully rebuilt the infrastructure in this system and about 160 others. Torn stopped walking. 160 systems, give or take. She stopped beside him. We've been busy. Those systems are not, he paused. Many of those systems are currently claimed. Some of them are claimed by empires that took them from species that were living there, she said. Yes. She said it without anger, without accusation, in the flat tone of someone stating geography. We know. We've looked at the records very carefully. Torn was a military man. He understood threat assessment. He was performing one in real time, standing in this room looking at displays that showed infrastructure his intelligence services had not known existed, in a system that had just held 200 of his ships in place, as easily as you might stop a toy on a table. What do you want, he said. To talk, she said, with everyone, the Grand Assembly, the empires, the Remnant Assembly. She looked at him with the same calm she had shown in every piece of footage from Crosspoint. We want to talk about what comes next, and if the empires decide what comes next doesn't include you. She did not answer immediately. She looked at one of the displays, and something in her expression changed, not dramatically, just a small shift, like a door that is almost but not quite closed. We'd like them to try to make that decision clearly understanding what they're deciding, she said. That's why we're having this conversation. He went back to his fleet. He sent his report to Heth. 199 of his 200 ships jumped home on his order. The 200th stayed behind. He put his most senior junior officer in command of it and gave her a data package and told her to transmit it to Heth directly, from a Keth-controlled relay, to ensure it arrived intact. The data package contained his full sensor readings, his complete record of the visit, and a personal recommendation from Torn, who had survived everything the 3 expansion campaigns had thrown at him, and who had stood in a room on Earth and come to a conclusion. The recommendation said, do not send another fleet, send a diplomat. We are not dealing with what we expected to deal with. Grand Executor, hear them out. The 200th ship jumped home. Earth held its silence, held it patiently, the way something very large can afford to be patient. Part 4, the emergency session of the Grand Assembly convened on Vellhari Prime, and for the first time in living memory, every tier was full. There were no empty seats. Every species with a standing delegation had sent its most senior member, which meant the chamber held beings, who normally dealt though with each other through intermediaries, gathered in the same room, and the air had the particular quality of a place where very large decisions were going to be made by people who were frightened and trying very hard not to look it. The empty seat from Earth was still there. Nobody had moved it. Heth stood at the speaking floor. He did not look frightened. The Keth were exceptional at not looking frightened. Admiral Torn's report has been distributed to all delegation heads, he said. We are here to determine a coordinated response. High Arbiter Celis of the Vellhari Conclave spoke from her tier with outstanding, which among the Vellhari was its own kind of statement. We have reviewed the report. The strategic implications are significant. They built in secret, Heth said, in a pocket of space we could not observe, for 1,000 years. We do not yet fully understand what they have built. We understand enough, Celis said. And then the chamber doors opened, and Yara Reyes walked in. She had not been invited. Station security had apparently tried to stop her, and had then apparently decided to stop trying. She walked to the center of the speaking floor without hesitation. Nobody moved to stop her, which was itself a statement about the state of the room. And she stood there and looked around at 300 delegates from 41 species and said, I hope I'm not interrupting something important. It took a moment for the translation units to process the human concept of irony. Heth looked at her. This session is closed to external parties. I know, she said. I came anyway. She turned slowly, taking in the whole chamber. You're talking about us. I thought we should be in the room. She looked up at the star map on the ceiling, the one with all the Keth red and the Vellhari blue and the tiny patches of everything else. I've been looking forward to seeing this. She looked at the star map for a moment. It's accurate, right? That's the current state? Nobody answered. We have a different map, she said. I'll share it later. I think it would be useful to compare. She turned to Heth. Grand Executor, we've been trying to arrange a direct conversation for 2 weeks. I appreciate that the situation is complicated, but I'd ask for the chance to speak here, since I'm already in the room. Heth looked at her. Behind the careful control of a Keth commander's face, Var, watching from his tier, could see something working. Calculation, assessment, the particular mental motion of someone recalibrating. Speak, Heth said. She did. She spoke for 40 minutes, and she was very clear. And she used no dramatic language and no threats and no performance. She said what Earth had done in the between. The research, the construction, the 1,000 years of development. She named specific technologies. She explained, briefly and technically, what the gold orbital coverage Admiral Torn had seen actually was. She described 160 systems that humans had quietly moved into during the years before Torn's fleet arrived. Systems that were, according to her map, either uninhabited or inhabited by species whose presence predated the Empire's claims. She did not threaten anyone. She did not need to. Then she said, we're going to make an offer. One offer to all parties. We'll lay it out fully in written form within 24 hours. It's a framework for what the galaxy looks like going forward. It is not a conquest plan. We are not interested in running an empire. She paused. We are, however, very interested in certain things being different from how they currently are, particularly as they pertain to species represented in the remnant assembly tier. The chamber was quiet. That's what we want to talk about, she said. Whether anyone else wants to talk is up to them. She left. The doors closed. Then Celis did something that she had not done in 40 years of public sessions. She stood up. We need to discuss this privately, she said. Privately meant the Vellhari delegation rooms on the 3rd level, which Heth entered because he wanted to, not because he was invited. The Morn trade head arrived because he went where power went, and power was clearly in this room. Var came because nobody told him not to. Celis stood at the center of the Vellhari room, with her arms behind her back and said, without preamble, our psychic surveillance team made 3 attempts to read Commander Reyes during her speech. Heth's carapace shifted, and the first attempt returned nothing. Complete null, as I experienced from her message before you ask. Celis said this with the precision of someone who has already prepared for the question. The second attempt triggered a feedback response in 2 of our 3 team members. Minor, they are recovered. And the third? Heth said. The third attempt returned a clear, intentional signal. Celis's expression did not change. It was a message. She knew we were attempting surveillance. She allowed the first 2 attempts to fail to demonstrate that she could block it. The third she allowed through deliberately. A pause. The message said, we know you're listening. We don't mind. We have nothing to hide. The room was quiet. Var sat in his chair and looked at his hands. He was thinking about a photograph. He was thinking about humans who threw themselves between Dorothi children and death without being asked. They can do this to all of us simultaneously, the Morin trade head said. Psychic blocking. The orbital systems. What else? Whatever else they've built, Heth said. We don't know what else they've built, the Morin head said. We saw Admiral Torn's report. We saw what they showed him. They showed him exactly what they chose to show him. We don't know the rest. Heth was quiet for a moment. We should strike first, before they have established themselves further. A combined fleet from all three powers, simultaneous assault. A combined fleet of what? Celis said. Combined against what? We don't know what we'd be attacking. We know what they showed us. Var spoke. He had not planned to. It came out anyway. They offered us food. Everyone looked at him. The Dorothi homeworld. 11 years ago, when the Keth agricultural consolidation left the third continent without supply lines. He looked at Heth. The Remnant Assembly filed 16 aid requests. Everyone was declined on administrative grounds. He looked at his hands. 40,000 Dorothi died. Nobody spoke. They were in the between, Var said. They have been in the between for 1,000 years. They cannot have helped with that. I know this. He looked up. I am simply telling you what kind of species we are talking about. The kind that when they were here was the kind that filed aid requests and also was the kind that, when the requests failed, went anyway. He stood. I'm going to go talk to Commander Reyes, he said. And I'm going to suggest, respectfully, that everyone in this room read Admiral Torn's actual personal recommendation before deciding on a combined strike. He paused at the door. The man has fought in 3 expansion campaigns. He knows what a winnable fight looks like. He left. The meeting between Var and Reyes lasted 3 hours, and nobody else was in the room. What they said to each other was not recorded. What came out of it, 12 hours later, was a joint Dorothi human communique to the other 10 Remnant Assembly species, laying out the terms of the offer Reyes had mentioned, specifically as they applied to the Assembly. The terms were straightforward, world by world, system by system. Every species in the Assembly that had been displaced, reduced, or administratively consolidated over the past 300 years was listed by name. Earth's position on each case was stated clearly. Earth was willing to back those positions. Concretely, the Keth Dominion and the Vellhari Conclave read the communique. They convened again. This time Var was not in the room. Heth made the decision that Sect had told him Torn's report argued against. He sent the combined fleet anyway. Every available ship. Keth, Vellhari, 3 squadrons of Morin hired units. 1,200 ships, the largest military force assembled since the Second Expansion War. They jumped toward Earth. They were very sure of what they were doing, and they were very sure of why they were doing it, and they were wrong about both. Part 5 The Coalition fleet came out of transit in Earth's system and found it as Torn had found it. Blue planet, yellow star, the deep quiet of a place that had been waiting. The difference was what the sensors showed this time. Nothing. The orbital infrastructure readings were gone. The gold coverage was gone. The energy signatures that had stopped 200 Keth warships were gone. Clean space, all the way from the transit point to Earth's upper atmosphere. Fleet Admiral Dresch of the combined coalition forces, who had been given supreme command by a joint Keth-Vellhari agreement, sat in his chair and looked at the clean sensor readings and thought, with the specific skill of someone who had commanded fleets for 30 years, that this was wrong. Full sweep, he said. Everything we have. The sweep took 4 minutes and confirmed. Nothing. Clean space. No infrastructure, no energy signatures, no defensive grid, and no ships. Earth's orbit was empty. Where is their fleet? His tactical officer said. They don't have a fleet, someone else said. Torn's report said no warships. There are 1,200 of us, Dresch said. And they have, he stopped. He had been about to say something that, when spoken out loud, was going to sound like the thing you said right before something went badly. His communicator activated. The voice was Reyes, calm as she had ever been on any recording anyone in the galaxy had seen. Admiral Dresch, welcome. We've been expecting you. I'd like to ask for 1 hour before you do anything. 1 hour, and we'll have something to show you. After that, you're free to make whatever decision you came here to make. Dresch looked at his fleet. 1,200 ships. The combined military power of the galaxy's 2 greatest empires. He had been ordered to end this situation. 1 hour, he said. It started 60 seconds after he replied. Not an attack, an opening. The space around Earth. The space his sensors had shown as empty was not empty. It had simply been, until this moment, off. Like a room where the lights have not been turned on. What came on now was not weapons. It was not infrastructure. It was everything at once. The orbital stations, the energy grid, the systems that Torn had seen a fraction of on his visit. All of it, spinning back to life, surrounding 1,200 ships with the quiet precision of something that had always been there. And then the planet itself. Earth lit up, not explosively, not threateningly. The night side of the planet became visible from space, and what it showed was a world that had been lived in carefully for 1,000 years. Cities that generated no visible light pollution but were clearly there. Agricultural regions that covered the right amount of land and no more. Oceans that were the exact deep blue of water that had been allowed to be healthy. And above it all, visible now on every sensor in every ship in the fleet, the full scope of what humanity had built. Not 160 systems, 412. From this system outward in all directions, human-built infrastructure threaded through the galaxy like roots through soil, quiet and unannounced and everywhere. 1,200 ships sat in the middle of it. Dresch looked at his tactical display for a long time. "We didn't want to show you all of this at once," Reyes's voice said. "We were trying not to overwhelm anyone, but we think it's better that you see it clearly before you decide anything." A pause. "We've had 1,000 years, Admiral. We used them. Why are you telling us this?" Dresch said. "If you wanted to end this, you could. We don't want to end it," she said. "We want to start it. Something new. Something that isn't what the last 300 years have been." Another pause. "We've been watching the galaxy since before we left. We left because we knew we weren't ready to help yet. We're ready now." Almost laughed. "It came out wrong. Help. Yes. No hesitation. That's what we came back to do." The coalition fleet did not fire a shot. This was not surrender. It was not defeat. It was the specific decision that very smart military officers make when the tactical picture stops being a picture they were trained for. Dresch sent the order to stand down and then sent a direct communication to Heth and Salus on the flagship relay, and his message was 3 sentences. "I've seen what they have. I am recommending we negotiate. Send your diplomats." It took 6 hours for the responses to come back. Heth's response was 1 word. Salus's was 3 sentences that said the same thing. They were coming. The agreement was called the Crosspoint Compact, though it wasn't signed at Crosspoint. It was signed on Earth, in a building with open windows that looked out at a garden, because the humans had asked if they could do it that way and nobody had objected. It was not a surrender document. It was not a treaty of conquest. It was, as Reyes had said it would be, a framework, what the galaxy looked like going forward. The Keth Dominion kept 60% of the systems it currently administered, minus the 27 that the remnant assembly species had been displaced from. The Vellhari Conclave kept its territory with similar adjustments. The Moran trade routes were declared open access, administered neutrally, which the Moran Trade Federation privately preferred anyway, because it removed the administrative overhead they had been handling badly for decades. The remnant assembly got its worlds back, every single one, not immediately, not without complication. It took years, the way most things that matter take years. But the framework existed, and the framework was backed by 412 human-administered systems, and the kind of orbital infrastructure that made 1,200 warships sit very still. And frameworks backed by those things have a way of being followed. High Arbiter Salus signed the compact with the careful signature of someone who was writing with both hands. One hand the one that chose to, one hand the one that understood it had no better option. There was honesty in that which Salus would never admit to, but which Reyes had quietly respected. Heth signed it standing up. Senator Var signed it on behalf of the Remnant Assembly. He held the pen for a long moment before he put it to the paper. Physical paper again. The humans liked physical things, physical records, things you could hold. Reyes was beside him. She did not rush him. He signed. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, the way his grandmother had put her hand on the shoulders of people who needed steadying. And then she moved on to the next piece of business. Because there was always next business, and she was very good at it. He stayed at the table after she left. He sat with the signed document in front of him and thought about 40 years of looking at an empty seat, and about his grandmother's certainty, and about the 40,000 Dorothi, who had died in a famine 11 years ago because no one was willing to help. He thought about what Reyes had said to him in their 3-hour meeting. The part that had not gone into any communique or record. She had said, "We know we can't fix what happened while we were gone. We know we weren't here. That matters to us. It matters in a way we're still working through as a species." She had looked at her hands. "But we're here now, and we're not leaving again." He had believed her. He still believed her. He put the photograph on the table beside the document. His grandmother, the village, the 2 humans laughing, permanent and improbable in their paper frame. He looked at them for a long moment. Old friends, the signal had said. Yes, that was what they were. 6 months after the compact was signed, a Dorothi girl named Sali, stood in a field on a world her people had been returned to. She was 9 years old. The field had been farmland before the displacement, and it was going to be farmland again, and right now it was tall, dry grass that reached her shoulders and rustled when the wind moved through it. Above her, the stars were beginning to come out as the sky darkened. She knew more about the stars than most 9-year-olds. Her mother had told her about the compact. Her teachers had told her about Earth. She knew the word between and what it meant, and what humanity had done in it. She knew words like infrastructure, and sovereign and framework, because children who grow up in the middle of history learn big words early. She looked at the stars. There were new lights up there now. Not stars. Steady, fixed orbital, the particular quality of something made and placed carefully in a specific position. The humans called them relay stations. They connected this system to others, and those to others, in a network that ran, her teacher had explained, to 412 systems and counting. The galaxy was connected now in a way it had not been before. She lay down in the tall grass and looked up. The field smelled like home smell, which her mother said was the right smell for this planet, and that she was going to learn it properly, this smell, and not forget it. Above her, the stars and the steady lights of human construction looked back. She thought about what her teacher had said, which was that humanity had gone away so they could come back as something worth returning as, and that this was a very strange and very specific kind of wisdom that had taken them 30 years of debate to agree on and 1,000 years to execute. She thought about that for a long time, watching the lights. Then she sat up, and the grass rustled around her, and she looked at the brightest of the steady lights, and she felt, not fully understanding it, just feeling it the way children feel things that are too large to think, that something had changed. That the galaxy she was going to grow up in was not the one her grandmother had grown up in. That somebody had been away for 1,000 years and come back and brought that change with them. She reached out her hand into the dark air and pointed at the steady light overhead, the way you point at something you're deciding to remember. Then she got up and walked home through the tall grass, and the stars came fully out above her, and the relay station light held its position. And the galaxy was different from what it had been. It would keep being different. That was the point. The station called Cross Point had been neutral territory for 200 years, which in practical terms meant that every empire watched it at all times, and nobody could do anything there without everyone else finding out. It sat at the crossing point of 4 major transit lanes and held a population of 80,000 from 60 different species. Its real economy was not trade. It was information, the buying and selling and sitting on, and occasional losing of it, to people who were better at the business of knowing things than you were. It was the most logical place for a first meeting. Everyone agreed on this without being asked. The human ship came out of transit on a clear morning by station time, which meant the observation decks were already full when it arrived. Every species in the known galaxy had a different way of dealing with things they did not understand. The Keth diplomatic courier that had docked 6 hours earlier transmitted an encrypted report the moment the ship appeared on sensors. The Morn information brokers pulled out their recording equipment before it had finished decelerating. The handful of remnant assembly civilians who lived in the station's lower districts pressed against the observation windows with an intensity that made station security officers nervous for reasons they couldn't cleanly define. The ship was not what anyone had expected. This was the first surprise, and it was a small one, but small surprises at the start of something are the kind you remember. A warship establishing dominance arrives large and loud, making sure the watching eyes understand exactly what they are looking at. This ship was medium-sized and elegant in the particular way of something built without compromise. Every surface doing exactly what it needed to do and nothing extra. No decorative armor plating. No forward-facing weapon geometry designed to make observers think about weapons. It moved through the docking approach with a precision that made experienced pilots on the observation deck go quiet and pay closer attention, because the kind of control implied by that movement was not control you saw in a ship operated by an ordinary crew. It docked without a single correction burn. The airlock opened. 3 people walked out. They looked to most of the species watching like nothing special at all. 2 legs, 2 arms. No carapace, no bioluminescent ridge, no secondary jaw or visible sensory array. They were wearing plain dark clothing. 2 of them were clearly security, positioned correctly, carrying themselves in the calibrated way of people trained to watch rooms. The third was a woman in her middle years. Brown skin, gray-streaked dark hair pulled back from her face. She moved the way certain people move when they have reached the point in their lives where they no longer feel the need to perform anything for anyone's benefit. She stopped in the center of the docking bay. She looked around. At the station officials, the Keth diplomatic staff, the Morin brokers, the general organized chaos of Crosspoint's curious population, and she took it all in with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, and she said, in clear standard galactic that needed no translation unit at all, "Hello." She said it the way you say hello to someone you have been looking forward to seeing for a very long time. Her name was Commander Yara Reyes. She was Earth's representative. She had not slept in 22 hours. None of that was visible anywhere on her face, or in her voice, or in the way she stood in the middle of the docking bay while 80,000 people of 60 species tried to figure out what to make of her. The station administrator, a Morin named Pelax who had run Crosspoint for 30 years and believed he had encountered every kind of complicated situation the galaxy could produce, got to her first. Technically, it was his station. This gave him the right. "Commander Reyes," he said, and the translation unit put it into clean standard galactic. "Welcome to Crosspoint. We were not certain what to expect." "That seems fair," she said. "We haven't been around in a while." She looked at him with a direct attention that Morin found subtly uncomfortable. They processed extended eye contact differently from humans, and humans tended not to know this, and said, "Is there somewhere we can sit and talk? I imagine there's a great deal of ground to cover." There was. Pelax led them to the station's official meeting rooms, which he had spent the previous 6 hours equipping with every security measure Crosspoint had available. He was already fairly sure this had been a waste of time. The woman did not feel dangerous. She felt calm. She felt calm in the way that very powerful things are calm. Not because there is nothing to worry about, but because the thing being calm has already thought through every possible version of what comes next and is comfortable with all of them. The Keth diplomatic courier's name was Sub-Executor Vren. He was already in the meeting room when they arrived, which was not how Pelax had planned the room assignments, but which was also not surprising, because the Keth were very good at being in places before anyone had decided to invite them. Vren did what senior Keth diplomats always did when entering a new situation. He established position and size immediately, taking the largest chair at the head of the table, placing his 2 aides at his flanks, and looked at Reyes with the calculating expression of something that was deciding how large a problem it was looking at. "The Keth Dominion welcomes the return of the human species," he said. "Grand Executor Heth has asked me to personally convey his interest in establishing a productive relationship between our peoples." "Tell him thank you," Reyes said. She sat down, not at the foot of the table, which would have made her subordinate in the positioning language that every species in the galaxy used, without discussing it. Not at the head, which would have been a direct challenge. In the middle, at the side, where she could see everyone. "I'd be glad to meet with him directly when the time is right. There's a great deal to talk about. The Grand Executor is particularly interested in understanding your development during your period of absence," Vren said. "He hopes you will appreciate that the current galactic order has certain established structures and agreements that—" "Certain established facts," Reyes said. She was not unkind about the interruption. She simply said it, and it landed, and it was true, and Vren stopped speaking. "Yes, we are aware of the established facts." She picked up the cup of water that had been placed at her seat, considered it briefly, put it down. "We've been watching." Vren's carapace shifted in the small way of a Keth controlling a reaction. "Watching. We left, Sub-Executor. We didn't stop paying attention." She said it without heat, without threat, in the same tone you use when stating something obvious that shouldn't need stating. "We know what the galaxy looks like now. We know what happened to many of the species that were here when we left. We know about the 3 expansion campaigns. We know about the consolidation acts. We know the current composition of the remnant assembly and how it compares to what it was 1,000 years ago." She paused the length of one breath. "We know about the Sarathi clearance, the Darathi 3rd reduction, the Pelion relocation program." The meeting room was very quiet. "We have been watching for a long time," she said. "We did not speak because we were not ready. We are ready now." "Ready for what precisely?" Vren said. "That," Reyes said, "is exactly the conversation I'd like to have." Senator Var arrived at Crosspoint 14 hours after Reyes's ship docked. He had not slept on the transport. He had spent the crossing reading everything his office had compiled. The sensor data from Mara's observatory, the decoded navigation vectors, the limited information coming out of Crosspoint's public channels about what was happening in the meeting rooms. He had read Mara's personal notes on the frequency match. He had read the historical files on human pre-departure diplomatic practice that someone in the assembly archives had put together in the 48 hours since the signal was first detected. He had looked at the photograph of his grandmother's village the whole time it sat on the seat beside him. The crosspoint security officer who met him at the docking bay was a young Dorothy woman named Ress, who was trying very hard to look professional and was struggling with it. And Var could see precisely why. She had clearly been crying recently and had not finished deciding how to feel about that. "Senator Voss," she said, "Commander Reyes's team left a message for your arrival." She handed him a folded piece of paper, physical paper. He unfolded it. "Senator, we would very much like to see you. Room 7, second level. Take all the time you need. We will be here." Reyes, he did not take his time. Reyes was alone in the room. Her security were outside the door. She was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of something hot. And when he walked in, she stood and looked at him, with the expression of someone who has read about a person carefully and is now meeting them for the first time, and finding the meeting is what they expected, which is its own kind of relief. She extended her hand. He knew enough human history to understand the gesture. He took it. Her handshake was brief and firm and did not try to prove anything. "Senator Var," she said, "I've read everything we have on your career, what you have built for the assembly in these conditions." She held his gaze. "It is remarkable. I mean that without any of the flattery in it." He had spent 40 years in politics. He knew the sound of a compliment being used as a tool. This was not that sound. He sat across from her. "I have questions," he said. "I would be concerned if you didn't," she said. "Where did you go?" She looked at him evenly. "Somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. We found a way to fold a section of space that couldn't be observed from outside. We called it the between." She said this plainly, as if folding space-time were the kind of solution you arrive at when you need uninterrupted time to work, which to her apparently it was. "We spent 1,000 years inside it. 1,000 years. We had a great deal to figure out." She turned her cup between her palms. "We could see where the galaxy was heading before we left. We were too young to do anything about it then. We didn't have the tools. We didn't have the understanding. So we made a decision, as a species. It took about 30 years of debate, which probably tells you something about us, to go away and build the tools and the understanding before we came back." She paused. "We thought it was better to wait until we could actually help rather than arrive too early and make everything worse." Var looked at her. "That is a very long time to wait." "We are patient," she said, "when we need to be." It was said quietly, just a simple statement of fact. It sat in the middle of the room like something much larger than the words that carried it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She thought for a moment, which he noted. She was someone who thought before speaking. "We are going to talk first. With everyone. With the empires, with the assembly, with the grand chamber. We are going to make offers and give the current powers the genuine chance to adjust." She said this with no judgment in it, the same way you might describe the stages of any reasonable process. Some will take that chance, some won't, and those who won't. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the window, where the station's exterior viewport showed open space and stars. The same stars they had always been. They had no idea what was moving through them. "We did not spend 1,000 years building weapons," she said. "That is the first thing I want you to understand. We built medicine, we built energy systems, we built agricultural methods that work on any world with any soil chemistry. We built schools and governance structures and psychological frameworks for species that have been living under occupation." She looked back at him. "The weapons were a small part. We built those too." She said the last sentence exactly the same way she had said the rest of it. The Keth warship arrived at Crosspoint 6 hours later. Not the diplomatic courier. An escort-class warship, the specific designation used when a diplomatic party was being escorted somewhere they had not chosen to go. It came out of transit and settled into the docking approach with the heavy deliberateness of something that expected other things to move aside for it. Var found Reyes on the station's observation deck. She was already there, watching it come in, arms folded over her chest. She did not look alarmed. She looked the way someone looks when they have anticipated something and are now watching it arrive on schedule. "They've sent an escort-class warship," Var said. "I can see that." She watched it approach. It was 3 times the size of her own ship and moved with the weight of something that had never been required to consider the weight of others. "Subexig tur Vren's idea or Heth's, I wonder. Are you?" He stopped. He had been about to ask if she was concerned. She looked at him. "No," she says it as if he had finished the question. She pulled out her communicator. She sent a message. He did not see the content. 8 minutes passed. The warship completed its docking approach and locked to the station. Its running lights were bright and regular, the way a warship's lights are when it wants to be noticed. Then all the lights went out. Every system on the Keth warship shut down at the same moment. Not an explosion, not a distress event. A clean, total, simultaneous shutdown, as if someone had reached in and turned off every circuit in the ship all at once. The warship hung in Crosspoint's dock, dark and completely still. 6 seconds passed, everything came back on, clean restart, no damage. The warship sat in its dock with every system running normally. And the communication channel opened, and the voice of the Keth captain came through. Not calm, not in control of itself the way a senior Keth military officer's voice is supposed to be. "What did you do to my ship?" Reyes spoke into her communicator. Her voice was exactly as it had been in the meeting room, exactly as it had been in the docking bay. "We demonstrated something, Captain. Your ship is undamaged. Nothing on it has been harmed. We wanted to show you what it feels like to have a conversation with us." A pause. "Sub-Executor Vren is in room 6, second level. Please tell him we would be glad to continue our discussions at his earliest convenience." She put the communicator away. She looked back out at the stars. Var stood beside her. He was old and tired, and had spent 40 years watching the galaxy grow smaller and crueler in ways that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the choices of the powerful. He had a photograph in his coat pocket, and a grandmother's voice in the back of his skull, and 40 years of hoping for something he had stopped letting himself fully believe in. "Now," Ray said, to no one in particular, with the quiet certainty of someone who has thought the situation all the way through, "we will see who wants to have a real conversation." She watched the stars. The stars watched back. Crosspoint hummed around them. 80,000 people of 60 species going about the business of being alive in a galaxy that had just quietly started to become something different from what it had been this morning. Var put his hand in his coat pocket and held the laminated photograph without taking it out. His grandmother would have liked this woman very much. He was sure of that. He stood there and said nothing, and was content for the moment to stand in this particular silence, which was the silence of something that had been building for 1,000 years and had just at last begun. Grand Executor Heth of the Keth Dominion was not, by any internal measure he respected, a being who made decisions from fear. He made decisions from information, from assessment, from the careful weighing of known variables against known outcomes, the way 3 centuries of empire building had taught his people to weigh everything. He had expanded Keth territory through 11 contested systems. He had absorbed 4 minor civilizations without a single significant military loss. He had sat across negotiating tables from every major power in the galaxy, and come away from every one of those tables having taken more than he gave. He sat in his command chamber on his flagship and read Sub-Executor Vren's reports from Crosspoint 6 times. Then he read Admiral Torn's personal recommendation twice. Then he set everything down and thought. The warship shutdown at Crosspoint was the detail he kept returning to. Not the size of Reyes's orbital infrastructure, which was extraordinary but could be quantified. Not the historical records on human pre-departure capability, which were thin but manageable. The warship shut down, 6 seconds of total darkness, clean restart, no damage, no entry, no boarding, no explanation of mechanism. His engineers had spent 3 days examining the warship's systems after it returned to Keth space and had found nothing. No foreign hardware, no software intrusion, no indication of how it had been done. Things you cannot explain, you cannot counter. He was aware that this thought was the beginning of the thing he was trying not to feel. He called Sect. She arrived in his command chamber within minutes. 61 years of service, and she still moved like someone with somewhere to be. She looked at the reports on his desk and then looked at him. "Torn's recommendation," he said. "I've read it," she said. "Your assessment of his assessment." Sect was quiet for a moment. This was not hesitation. She did not hesitate. It was the pause of someone selecting the right words for a difficult thing. Torn is not a cautious officer by temperament. He ran the 5th expansion on an 18-month timeline when the standard projection was 4 years. His recommendation to negotiate rather than press is not something he would write lightly. "No," Heth said. "It is not." He saw things in that system that he did not include in the formal report, Sect said. "I believe this because the formal report has gaps in it that a man of Torn's precision does not leave by accident." Heth looked at her. "What kind of gaps?" "The kind that suggest he saw more than he felt was safe to transmit in writing." She met his eyes. "He is a thorough man, Grand Executor. He filed a report with holes in it. That is its own kind of data." Heth was quiet. Outside his command chamber windows, Keth space moved past. His space, read on every map, the inheritance of 300 years of careful and relentless work. He had spent his life building this. He was not the kind of being who let things threaten it without responding. "Prepare a combined fleet," he said. "Full complement. I want the Vellhari approached for joint contribution. And the Morn, hired units, as many as available." Sek looked. Torn recommend against. "Torn is a good officer," Heth said. He saw something that frightened him. Frightened officers sometimes mistake caution for wisdom. He turned back to the window. "We will see what we are actually dealing with." Directly, Sek did not argue further. She had made her position clear, and he had heard it, and the decision was made. "Understood," she said. "Timeline? 3 weeks," he said. "I want 1,200 ships." She left to begin the preparations. Heth stood at his window for a long time after she was gone. The stars outside were his. The space between them was his. The trade routes and the transit lanes and the administered systems with their populations of compliant species. His. 300 years of his family's work, his work, made permanent in the red of every galactic map in existence. He thought about a woman who had sat in the middle of a negotiating table, not at either end, and said, "We have been watching." He built the thought into a wall and put it behind him. Then he went to plan a war. Admiral Torn heard about the combined fleet 3 days before it launched. He was in his office on the Keth homeworld, nominally on administrative rotation, actually, because Heth had quietly reassigned him after the Crosspoint report, in the way that powerful leaders reassign officers whose honest assessments are inconvenient, not punished, just moved sideways, into a position where his opinion would not be the first one in the room. When the fleet composition orders came across his desk, routine, since he still held a senior enough rank to receive operational briefings, he read them once, set them down, and sat still for a long time. 1,200 ships. He had stood on Earth. He had walked across its surface in the open air, and breathed its air, and stood inside a building that covered more ground than his flagship, and seen only a fraction of what the humans wanted him to see. He had come home and written a report with very careful gaps in it. Gaps shaped like the things he had decided were too large to put in writing. He had recommended diplomacy, not because he was frightened, though he was, but because he had stood in that room with Reyes and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to experienced military minds sometimes, that there was no version of this that ended well for whoever started shooting first. He wrote a personal message to Heth. He said, "Grand Executor, I know the decision has been made. I ask only that you know I stand by my recommendation fully. What is in that system is not what we expect it to be. Please be careful." He sent it. He did not expect it to change anything. He was right. The combined fleet launched on a clear day, by Keth standard reckoning. 1,214 ships forming up in the assembly coordinates outside Keth space. The largest military force gathered since the Second Expansion War. Keth ships made up the core. 800 vessels, ranging from escort class to 3 full carrier groups. The Vellhari contributed 240 ships, sleek and pale, and covered in the sensor arrays that the Vellhari built better than anyone else in the galaxy. The Morin hired units were 62 vessels of various classifications, crewed by a mix of species who did this kind of work for whoever paid and paid well. Fleet Admiral Dresch commanded from the Keth carrier Permanence, which had been Heth's flagship during the 5th expansion, and was chosen for this mission for reasons that were partly tactical, and partly about the message sent by a flagship's name. Dresch was 68 years old and had not lost a fleet engagement in his career. He was not the kind of officer who lost sleep before operations. He was the kind of officer who reviewed plans until the plans were correct, slept well, and executed. He had reviewed these plans. They were correct by every standard he knew how to apply. You take 1,200 ships to a target with unknown capability. You overwhelm it before it can reveal that capability. You end the uncertainty. He gave the jump order. They came out of transit at the edge of Earth's solar system and ran sensor sweeps for 90 minutes before moving. The readings were wrong from the start. Earth's star was in position. The planets were in their correct orbits. The third planet, blue, green, and white at long-range optics, exactly as the historical files described, was there. Everything else was not where it should have been. A young species, 200 years into space-time travel before its disappearance, should have left behind the scattered infrastructure of those early centuries. Preliminary stations. Some activity on the nearest moon. The tentative reaching marks of a civilization just beginning to extend itself. Instead, the sensors returned readings from Earth's orbit all the way out past the 4th planet. Dense, layered, complex readings that the sensor AI classified as metal and composite and energy signatures of unknown type. It flagged them as unknown. It kept flagging them, through 3 separate analysis runs, as unknown. Unknown as in unclear, Dresch said to his sensor chief. Unknown as in not in any category our systems have, she said. She had the careful voice of someone reporting something they have checked more than once. It's not that the readings are faint or distorted. They're clear. They're just new. Dresh absorbed this. Standard advance. We follow the broadcast approach vectors. He followed the vectors that the human signal had published. The safe routes, hazard designated, mapped with the kind of precision that only came from people who knew exactly what was in the space they were mapping, because ignoring labeled safe routes in an unknown system was not something a competent fleet admiral did. They went slowly. 90 minutes into the approach, a message came in on the standard band, a voice, human, calm, Fleet Admiral Dresh. Welcome to our system. We have been tracking your approach since transit emergence. We are glad you followed the safe vectors. Please continue on your current heading. We would like to talk. Dresh stopped the fleet. He sat in his command chair and said nothing for a moment. The voice had used his name, his correct rank and name, in a system that had been empty for 1,000 years. His intelligence officer, across the bridge, met his eyes and had no answer. How did they know my designation, someone said. Nobody answered that either. Dresh responded. This is Fleet Admiral Dresh of the Combined Coalition Forces. We are conducting a military assessment of this system. We require full disclosure of your defensive installations and territorial claims. 11 seconds. Long enough to start wondering if there would be no answer. Then, those are reasonable requests, Admiral. We would rather answer them in person than over a channel. Please continue your approach to the following coordinates. A pause. We think it will be more useful to show you than to tell you. The coordinates appeared on his navigation system. A point 60,000 kilometers above Earth's North Pole. He looked at them for a long time. Proceed, he said. They moved in slow. 200 of the 1,200 ships went first. A vanguard, shields at full, weapons charged but not deployed, sensors running everything they had. The other 1,000 held at the outer marker. Standard advance formation for entering unknown territory. The infrastructure readings grew stranger with every 1,000 kilometers. The energy signatures were everywhere in the system, but formed no pattern that matched any defensive grid in Keth military doctrine, any offensive installation on record, any known design from any known civilization. They were not arranged to protect. They were not arranged to threaten. They were arranged in a way that had its own internal logic that his tactical officers kept trying to decode and kept failing to decode. At 40,000 kilometers, the Vanguard stopped. Not on Dresh's order. Every ship in the Vanguard simply stopped. Engines running. All systems operational. No alarms, no collision, no distress signals from any crew. Stopped and held and could not move forward, exactly as if something large and invisible and completely calm had placed itself in their way. Dresh's communicator activated. Admiral. We don't want this to become a battle. Neither of us wants the losses that would follow from that. The voice was the same voice, unhurried. We've stopped your forward group as a demonstration. Nothing on any of your ships is damaged. Nothing will be damaged. We want you to look at your long-range sensors before you decide on a next action. Dresh looked. Earth was changing around them, not the planet, not the atmosphere. What was changing was the space between the fleet and the planet. The space his sensors had been trying to categorize for 90 minutes. It was resolving, or revealing, or perhaps the more accurate word was activating. The unknown readings, the layered complex of metal and composite and energy that the sensor AI had kept filing as an unknown category, were moving into a configuration that was still unknown but no longer invisible. The sensor overlay stopped flickering between analyses and held, solid gold across every display on every ship in the fleet, spreading from Earth outward, filling the space between the planet and where 1,200 ships were sitting. 1,200 ships. Inside something. They had been inside it for 51 minutes. We've had a long time to build, the voice said. 1,000 years. And we have always been very good at building things. A longer pause this time. We are not going to harm you. We need you to understand this clearly, because what we are about to say will sound like a threat, and it is not meant as one. It is meant as an honest description of the situation. Another pause. You cannot win an engagement in this system, not because your forces are insufficient by any standard you have applied to conflicts before now, but because the standards you have applied to conflicts before now do not describe what you are currently inside. Dresh looked at his tactical display. He looked at the gold overlay. He looked at the frozen Vanguard, sitting still and intact and perfectly unharmed inside something that 1,200 warships had entered without detecting. He had commanded fleets for 30 years. He had never, not once, encountered a situation that his training did not give him a category for. He had one now. We would like to invite one representative to the surface, the voice said. A conversation. That is all we are asking for. After the conversation, your fleet will be released and you may make whatever decision you came here prepared to make, with full information. Dresh made the decision. The kind that did not feel good and was completely correct. I'll go, he said. He went down in a single shuttle, alone except for his pilot. Earth from below was a world that had been given time. The sky was the particular blue of air that had not been processed industrially in decades. The forests that were visible from the shuttle's approach were the dense and specific green of old growth. Not planted forests, not managed reserves, but trees that had been allowed to become what trees become when nothing stops them. The coastline they crossed was clear water over visible rock. The shuttle landed in a field. Reyes met him at the landing ramp. She shook his hand. She was exactly as every report described her, unhurried, direct, carrying the easy confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and knew it. She walked him to a building that was modest from the outside and was, on the inside, an operations center that covered 6 times the ground his flagship's command deck covered. Displays and systems and infrastructure that his sensor chief's unknown category problem made suddenly comprehensible. Because you could not put new things into old categories. And everything in this room was new. 342 orbital installations in this system, Reyes said, walking beside him through the main floor. She said it the way you say things you are quietly proud of. Not boastfully, but with the satisfaction of work that went the way you hoped. 4 deep space stations beyond the outer planets. And she paused at a display that showed a map, and the map was not a map of Earth's system. 162 other systems at current count. Dresh stopped walking. The count changes, she said. We're still building. 162 systems, he said. Some of them are currently claimed by coalition member empires, she said. She did not look at him when she said it. She looked at the map. Specifically, systems that were taken from species who were living there before the claims were made. We've looked at the records carefully. She turned to him. We have very detailed records. He stood in the middle of that operations floor and did what he had been trained to do. He assessed. He assessed with everything he had, against every standard he had been given, and every one he had built for himself in 30 years of command. What do you want? He said. She looked at him with the patient, level attention she gave everything. A conversation with everyone. The full assembly, the empires. A framework for what the galaxy looks like going forward. She paused. Not conquest. We are not interested in running what they run. We're interested in things being different. Different how? She looked at the map again. At 162 systems and the gold overlay that was sitting in this system around 1,200 ships. Different in the ways that matter, she said. You know which ways those are. He did. He was a Keth Fleet Admiral, and he had run expansion campaigns, and he knew exactly which ways those were, because he had been part of making them what they were. He went back to his shuttle. He sat in it for a long time before signaling the pilot. Then he gave the order that ended his career, and was still clearly, correctly, the right order to give. He recalled the full fleet. All 1,200 ships turned and formed up and moved back toward the transit point. Every ship intact, no engagement, no damage. 1,200 ships retreating in good order from a planet that had not fired a single weapon. He kept one ship, his own. He sent a full report and a personal message to Heth and Celis both, on the most secure relay he had access to. The personal message was longer than Torn's had been. He included more detail, because he was the second senior officer to come back from that system with the same recommendation, and he wanted to be very clear about the reasoning this time. The message said, in part, I have stood inside what they have built. I have seen its scope. I have spoken with their representative. I have made the following assessment. This is not a military problem. A military response will not resolve this and will cost us more than we can calculate in advance. This is a negotiation. I recommend we begin it immediately, with the full weight of our diplomatic capability, and that we do so without preconditions. He also said, they are not what we expected. I do not mean their technology, I mean them. I do not have better words for this yet, but I believe it matters. His ship sat in the outer system and waited for a response. Earth sat behind him, quiet and patient, and very, very old now in the way that only things which have been through time, and chosen carefully what to carry forward from it are old. The stars held their positions. The gold in the sensor readings stayed warm. The emergency session of the Grand Assembly was called with 48 hours' notice, which was the minimum the charter allowed, and the first time in living memory that the minimum had been used. Every tier was full. This had not happened in 230 years. Not since the Second Expansion War's ceasefire negotiations had dragged every delegation to Vellhari Prime simultaneously. 312 delegates from 41 species filled the curved tiers of the Grand Assembly Chamber all the way to the upper level, which normally sat empty because the species assigned to it had either been absorbed or reduced to observer status. Today, even those seats had bodies in them. Junior aides and attachés pressed into service because their senior officials had decided for the first time in a long time that having more eyes in the room was worth the protocol violations. The empty seat was still there, carved black stone, unmarked except for the word Earth in symbols nobody had fully translated. It sat at the back of the main tier, exactly where it had always been, and every delegate who walked past it either looked at it or worked very hard not to. Senator Var arrived early. He sat in the remnant assembly tier and watched the chamber fill and thought about how different it felt when the room was full of people who were actually paying attention. The Grand Assembly on a normal day was theater. Performed governance, positions staked in advance, outcomes negotiated in private rooms before anyone stood at the speaking floor. Today it was something else. Today it had the quality of a room in which the people present were not entirely sure what was about to happen. That was new. Grand Executor Heth stood at the speaking floor when the session opened. His carapace was the deepest blue-black Var had ever seen on a living Keth, the color of an authority that had not yet decided it needed to adjust. He read the summary of Dresch's report into the formal record. He read Torn's earlier report as well. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. The numbers did the work. 162 systems, 342 orbital installations, 1,200 ships stopped in open space for 51 minutes without a single weapon fired. When he finished, the chamber was quiet in the specific way of a room that is absorbing something it did not want to absorb. High Arbiter Celeste of the Vellhari Conclave spoke from her tier without standing, which was the Vellhari way of indicating a contribution that was too important to be performed. Both reports contain the same personal recommendation, she said. 2 senior military officers, operating independently, have recommended immediate negotiation. Both officers were operating under conditions of significant psychological pressure, said a Keth sub-commander from the upper tier. The assessment may reflect their emotional state rather than strategic reality. Admiral Torn has commanded 3 expansion campaigns, Heth said, without turning around. He does not have emotional states during operations, a pause that was itself a rebuke. He has assessments. The sub-commander did not speak again. Silas continued. The Vellhari Conclave has completed its independent analysis of the available sensor data. Our conclusion is consistent with both officers' field assessments. We are not dealing with a standard military variable. She looked around the chamber with the specific stillness of someone who has already decided how she feels, and has decided that certainty is more useful than drama. We are dealing with something we do not fully understand. I would recommend this assembly proceed on the assumption that what we do not understand about this situation significantly outweighs what we do. This was, Var reflected, the most honest thing he had heard said from the floor of the Grand Assembly in 40 years. Then the chamber doors opened. She did not knock. She did not send an aide ahead. She did not wait at the entrance for acknowledgement. Yara Reyes walked through the doors of the Grand Assembly chamber, crossed the observation floor between the tiers, and stepped onto the speaking floor as if she had been assigned to it. Her 2 security personnel stayed at the door. She came alone to the center of the floor and stood there and looked up at 312 delegates from 41 species looking back at her. She did not look small in the room. Var had expected her to look small in the room. The Grand Assembly chamber was designed to make individuals look small, the tiers rising steeply on all sides. The domed ceiling painted with star maps, the speaking floor a deliberately exposed position at the bottom of a bowl of watching eyes. It made everyone look small. It was supposed to. That was the design. Rhea stood in the middle of it and looked like she had been the one who designed it. Heth's carapace went through 3 rapid color shifts. He controlled it quickly, but not quite quickly enough. This session is closed to external parties, he said. I know, she said. I came anyway. She turned slowly, looking at every tier, and her expression was not confrontational and not deferential and not performing anything at all. It was simply the expression of someone who is genuinely interested in what they are seeing. She looked up at the star map on the dome. We have a different map, she said. I'll share it with everyone after the session. I think the comparison will be useful. She turned to Heth, Grand Executor. I know this is not how you planned this session to go. I'll ask for 30 minutes of the assembly's time. If the body wants me to leave after that, I will leave. A pause. But I think it's better that I'm in the room. We're talking about Earth's future and the galaxy's future in the same breath. We should be in the room. The chamber was quiet. Heth looked at her for a long moment. Var watched him do it. He was watching the Grand Executor of the Keth Dominion, the most powerful individual in the known galaxy, decide something in real time. It was a rare thing to see. Most decisions made by powerful beings were made before they walked into rooms. This one was being made here now, in front of 312 witnesses. Speak, Heth said. She spoke for 43 minutes. Nobody asked her to stop at 30. She was not loud. She was not dramatic. She used no emotional language and no threats, and no moments of deliberate pause designed to create tension in the room. She simply described things clearly, in order, the way a person describes things when they are confident that the things themselves are sufficient. She described what Earth had done in the between, not vaguely, precisely the research programs by name and field, the construction timelines. The population that had been born, lived, and died in the fold of space humanity had retreated into, generation after generation, each one carrying forward the project their grandparents had started. She described what it felt like, she said, to be a species that had made a collective decision, and then held that decision across 1,000 years, through every generation, because each generation understood what the decision was for. Var wrote that sentence in the notes he kept. He wrote it twice. She described the infrastructure. Not all of it there was, she said plainly. Infrastructure she was not going to disclose in an open session, which was the most honest thing anyone had ever said from the Grand Assembly's speaking floor, because every power in the room did exactly the same thing and never admitted it. She described enough. The orbital coverage, the 162 systems, the nature of what Torn and Dresch had encountered. She explained the mechanism of the fleet arrest, not the full technical basis but the principle. She explained it in terms that the engineers and military advisors in the room could follow, and she watched their faces as she did. And her expression did not change when she saw what landed there. Then she came to the part about the remnant assembly. We have looked carefully at the history of the past 300 years, she said. We have looked at the records of every species currently represented in the remnant assembly tier. She paused for the first time, not for effect, but because she was choosing her next words with particular care. We know what happened to them. We know who did what. We know the difference between administrative consolidation and what administrative consolidation actually means when you look at the numbers of people involved. The chamber was perfectly still. We are not here to punish anyone, she said. I want to be very clear about that. We are not a court. We are not an occupying force. We are not interested in retribution. She looked at Heth. She looked at Celis. She looked at the Morin tradehead and the other secondary powers in their tiers. We are interested in what comes next. And what comes next, from our perspective, has to include making certain things right. Not all at once, not through force, through a framework that everyone in this room has the chance to agree to or not agree to. She looked around the chamber one final time. The offer will be in writing within 24 hours. One offer, to everyone, with the full terms available to all parties simultaneously. She stepped back from the center of the floor. Thank you for the time, she said. I'll be outside when you're ready to talk. She left. The doors closed. The chamber stayed quiet for 11 seconds. Var counted them. Then everyone started speaking at once. The private meeting convened in the Vellhari delegation suite 2 hours after the session formally closed. Heth arrived because he wanted to, not because he was invited. The Morin tradehead, Councillor Bren, arrived because she went where power concentrated, and power was clearly concentrating here. Var arrived because nobody stopped him, and he had learned in 40 years of politics that absence from a room was a choice with consequences. Celis stood at the center of the Vellhari, sweet with her hands behind her back, and the perfectly arranged expression of someone who has been thinking very hard and has decided what she thinks. Our psychic surveillance team made 3 attempts to read Commander Reyes during her address, she said. Heth's carapace shifted, and the first attempt returned a complete null. No surface reading, no emotional resonance, no accessible current, as though the subject were not present. Celis's voice was even. The second attempt triggered a feedback response in 2 of our 3 operators. Minor cognitive disruption. Both have recovered. Bren's tentacles moved in the rapid pattern of the Morin processing something unwelcome. And the third attempt? The third attempt was allowed through deliberately, Celis said. It returned a clear intentional signal. A message. The room waited. It said, we know you are trying to read us. We have known since the first attempt. We do not mind. We have nothing to hide. But we thought you should know that we know. Silas's secondary eyelids lowered briefly, and then it said, "You may try again if you would like. We will let the next one through as well." The room was very quiet. Var looked at the floor and thought about a woman who had stood at the speaking floor of the Grand Assembly and described 1,000 years of collective human decision-making in plain language and watched the room absorb it. Nothing to hide. He thought about that. She could have blocked the third attempt, Sela said. She allowed it as a demonstration. She wanted us to know that our surveillance capability is visible to them, that it does not concern them, and that they are choosing transparency over counter-surveillance. Silas looked around the room. I have been High Arbiter for 22 years. I have never encountered a political actor who chose to demonstrate their own invulnerability by being open about it rather than by concealing it. She paused. It is, from a strategic standpoint, a more sophisticated move than concealment would have been. Heth said nothing. Bren's tentacles stilled. The offer, she said. What does it say? It hasn't been formally delivered yet, Var said. 24 hours from the session close. We have people working on projecting the likely terms, Heth said. I have already received a preliminary copy, Var said. Everyone looked at him. He had the envelope in his coat pocket. He had found it on his chair when he returned to the remnant assembly tier after Reyes left the chamber. A physical paper envelope, sealed, with his name on the outside in handwriting he did not recognize. Inside was a single page, dense with terms and subsections, and at the top a handwritten note. The note said, Senator, we wanted you to have time to read it first. You'll see what it says about the Assembly's worlds. When you're ready to talk about implementation, we're ready to listen. Reyes. He had read it twice on his way to this room. He was still somewhere behind the part of him that had spent 40 years learning to sit with hard feelings and not show them, trying to process what the terms for the remnant assembly said. He did not show them the letter, not yet. She gave you the terms in advance, Celis said. It was not a question. She did, Var said. Why? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because we have been waiting the longest, he said, and she knows it. Heth made a sound that the translation unit rendered as the Keth equivalent of a skeptical exhale. This is a strategy, he said, dividing the assembly from the major powers, building a coalition around the most sympathetic group first. Yes, Var said, it is also a kindness. Both things are true at the same time. He met Heth's eyes. She is very good at doing two things at once. The 24 hours passed. The formal offer arrived simultaneously at every delegation's secure channel, exactly as Reyes had said it would. It was 47 pages, precisely written, with no ambiguous language and no hidden conditions. Var had read the full version by the time most delegations had finished their first pass. The terms were fair in the specific way that terms can only be fair when the party offering them does not need them to be unfair to get what they want. The major empires kept the bulk of their territory. They kept their trade routes and their administrative systems, and most of their infrastructure. They gave up specific things. 27 systems for the Keth, 19 for the Vellhari, a restructuring of the Morin routes that the Morin privately would have preferred anyway. The framework established a new oversight body with genuine teeth, staffed jointly, with Earth holding a guaranteed seat and the Remnant Assembly holding 5. And the Remnant Assembly got its worlds back, not all at once. The framework had a 30-year implementation timeline, world by world, with oversight at each stage. But the words were on the page, in writing, backed by something that had stopped 1,200 warships in open space. And the words said, these worlds belong to these peoples, and the situation will be corrected. Var read those words and set the document down and sat in his office on Crosspoint Station, where he had been working since arriving. And he did not move for several minutes. It was Heth who broke the coalition, not publicly, not formally. He spent 4 days in meetings with Silas and the Morin Trade Council. And in those meetings he argued for a combined military response, the largest possible force, every available ship, strike before Earth's political position solidified further. He argued it with the specific persuasiveness of a being who had been arguing military necessity for 300 years and was very good at it. Celis listened. She asked clarifying questions. She weighed the arguments. Then she said, very calmly, we attempted to psychically surveil their ambassador in an open session of the Grand Assembly, with 3 operators, and she was aware of all 3 attempts before any of them registered to read. She allowed one through as a courtesy, a pause. Grand Executor, I am the most capable psychic in the conclave. I have never encountered a mind I could not read at range. She was sitting 20 meters from my operators. They received nothing. Heth was quiet. I am not saying the military option is impossible, Celis said. I am saying I do not know what we are pointing weapons at. And I have learned, in 22 years, that pointing weapons at things you do not understand produces outcomes you did not plan for. She looked at him steadily. I will not commit Vellhari forces to this. The coalition collapsed without ever being formally announced. 3 days later, Heth did something that Var, who was watching from the remnant assembly tier when it happened, had not expected to see in his lifetime. He sat down at a negotiating table with Reyes, just the two of them, and their respective aides in a private room at Crosspoint with no recording devices. Reyes had suggested the no recording condition, and Heth had agreed, which itself told Var something he turned over in his mind for days afterward. Nobody knew what was said in that room. What came out of it 2 days later was Heth's signature on the framework, not enthusiastic, not accompanied by any public statement beyond the minimum required by the charter, but on the page, real, ink and authority and the formal commitment of the Keth Dominion to terms it had not written. Celis signed the next morning. The Morn signed before lunch. That evening, after the signings were recorded and the formal session had closed, Var found Reyes on a Crosspoint observation deck. She was alone, standing at the viewport, looking at the stars with the specific quality of attention of someone who is not seeing the stars but something further away. He stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. He asked you something, Var said, in the private room. Heth. She glanced at him. Everyone asks me something in the private room. He asked you why, Var said. Why the framework? Why not simply establish control? Why offer terms at all when we could have what? She said. He looked at the stars, when you could have simply won. She was quiet for a moment. What would winning look like? She said. Occupation, administration, running an empire? She shook her head, a small movement. We had 1,000 years to think about what we actually wanted. An empire was never on the list. What was on the list? She turned from the viewport and looked at him directly. In the observation deck's dim light, she looked tired in a way she had not allowed herself to look in any meeting or session or public moment he had witnessed. The particular tiredness of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and is now very slowly setting it down. To come back, she said. To fix what we could fix. To make it so the species who were losing because nobody strong enough cared. So that stops. She looked back at the stars. We didn't go away for 1,000 years to come back and be the next empire. We went away so we could come back and be something else. What else? She thought about this honestly, which he had come to understand was the only way she thought about anything. Something worth trusting, she said. Var reached into his coat pocket. He took out the photograph. He set it gently on the observation deck rail between them, and she looked down at it. The laminated paper, his grandmother's village, the two humans with their wide and unguarded smiles. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Aid workers, Var said. After a drought, they stayed 2 years. She nodded slowly. My grandmother said they were among the finest people she had ever known. He looked at the photograph. She told me that story every year of my life that I was with her. She told me you would come back. Reyes looked at the photograph and then looked at the stars, and the tiredness that she had let show for the first time was still there. And it was the tiredness not of someone who had failed, but of someone who had finished something very long, and was deciding what to feel about that. We should have been here sooner, she said. It was a quiet sentence, barely above speaking to herself, but it landed in the room the way quiet sentences do when the person saying them has earned the weight of them. Var picked up the photograph and put it back in his pocket. You're here now, he said. They stood at the viewport together for a long time after that, the senator and the commander, the old man who had waited 40 years, and the woman who had carried 1,000, watching the same stars from the same deck. While below them and across the galaxy, ink dried on a document that was going to matter for a very long time. The signing happened on Earth. This was Reyes's suggestion, and she had made it simply, without ceremony, in a brief message to all delegation heads on the morning after the framework terms were formally accepted. She said, we would like to host. We think it would mean something to do it here. The approach vectors are published. You are all welcome. Nobody objected. 12 delegations made the journey. The Keth diplomatic vessel. The Vellhari envoy ship, pale and quiet, running its sensor arrays the entire approach because the Vellhari were constitutionally incapable of being in an unknown system without scanning it. The Moran trade representative in a ship that was half office and half archive. The 11 species of the remnant assembly, arriving in a loose formation that an observer might have called accidental, but was not. They had coordinated their transit timing so that they arrived together as a group because they had learned a long time ago that there was safety in being seen as a group and had never unlearned it. They followed the published vectors through Earth system, and the sensor readings were there again. The gold overlay, the layered infrastructure, the installations that the best analysts from 3 empires had spent weeks examining remotely and had still not fully categorized. But it was different this time. The fleet arrest was not repeated. The ships moved freely on their approach vectors, smoothly, as if the system itself was welcoming them, and the readings were not threatening but simply present, the way the features of a landscape are present. Not performing, just there. Earth appeared on approach optics as it always appeared. Blue and white and green, unhurried, with the deep beauty of a world that had not been asked to justify its existence in a very long time. They landed on a wide plain that had clearly been prepared for the occasion. Cleared and leveled, with structures raised to accommodate 12 different physiologies, shade and temperature controls calibrated per species, water and atmosphere available in appropriate mixtures at every station. A human detail had done this work. The delegation stepped off their ships into an environment that had been built to make them comfortable, and the thought that stayed with several of them, though none mentioned it in the formal records, was, they thought about each of us separately. Reyes met them on the plain, no podium, no platform, no formal arrangement of anyone above or below anyone else. She stood in the open space between the landing zones and shook hands with every delegation head who would accept the gesture, and bowed to the ones whose customs it suited better, and made eye contact with each of them for a moment in a way that was brief and specific enough to not be overwhelming, long enough to be genuine. She led them to the signing building. It was a low structure with open windows on all sides. Through the windows, a garden was visible, not a formal garden, not a diplomatic garden designed to make a statement, but the kind of garden that has been grown by people who like gardens and have had time to let things grow the way they want to grow. Old trees, paths between them that went where feet had made them go rather than where a planner had put them. Inside, a long table. Actual wood which no synthetic material had ever convincingly matched and which was therefore a statement of its own kind. That this was a real thing, done once, permanent. Chairs arranged for every delegation. Copies of the 47-page framework at every seat. Printed on physical paper, because the humans apparently felt that documents of this kind deserved to be physical. Var sat in the remnant assemblies, 5 allocated seats with his 4 counterparts, the senior representatives of the Surathi, the Pelian, the Durathi border colonies, and the smallest of the assembly species, the Kari, who had been down to 11,000 individuals at last census and who had sent their eldest council member, a woman of extraordinary age who had not been off her homeworld in 30 years but had come here because she said she would not miss this if it was the last thing she did. The eldest Kari council member's name was Orith. She sat at the table and put both of her small hands flat on the surface of it, and she looked at the wood, and then she looked at the garden through the open window, and she said something quietly in Kari that the translation unit rendered as, "I told them it would happen." Nobody asked who she had told or when. The signing took 3 hours. This was longer than expected and shorter than feared. The Keth delegation requested 3 clarifications on the boundary implementation language, which were dressed in writing by Reyes's legal team within 20 minutes of each request, which the Keth delegation did not openly surprise at, but which Var could see landing on sub-executor Vren. Heth had sent Vren to sign, which was either a slight or a test, and either way Vren was here doing the work, in the form of a very faint recalibration of posture each time. The Vellhari requested no clarifications. Celis had sent an arbiter named Kalen, who read every page with the complete attention of someone who had read it 4 times before and was reading it a 5th to confirm. When she signed with the specific deliberateness of someone who understands that some actions cannot be undone and has decided, completely, to do the action anyway. The Morin signed quickly. Bren was practical. She had done the numbers. The restructured trade routes under the new framework made the Morin better off economically in the 15-year projection, and the Morin were excellent at 15-year projections. She signed, put the pen down, and looked at Reyes with the direct gaze of a being completing a transaction. "The trade route guarantees," she said. In Section 14, Reyes said. Subsection 3, guaranteed and backed by Earth transit infrastructure effective from the date of signing. Bren nodded once. Done. The remnant assembly signed last. This was not an accident. Reyes had arranged the order, and Var had understood why when he saw it. Last meant witness to everything that came before. Last meant the Empire signing first, committing first, the power being recorded before the less powerful. It was a small thing. It was not small. Var signed for the Dorathi. His 4 counterparts signed for their peoples. Then Orith of the Kari put her old hands around the pen and made her mark on the page. And her hands did not shake, and her face was the face of someone who has been waiting a very long time and has finally reached the end of the wait and found it exactly as they believed it would be. She put the pen down. She said in Kari, which the translation unit rendered, "Good. Now let's get to work." The work began before the ships left. This was also Reyes's design. She had not wanted the signing to be the conclusion. She had wanted it to be the starting point, the thing from which the actual work grew. Before the delegations reboarded their ships, her teams had already begun the first stage of implementation, the transfer of provisional sovereignty documents for the 7 remnant assembly worlds whose return had been scheduled in the framework's first 5-year phase. 7 worlds, small starts, but the documents were real, and the backing behind them was real. And by the time the Keth diplomatic vessel had cleared Earth's orbital infrastructure on its way home, the provisional sovereignty documents had been transmitted to the relevant planetary governments. What was left of them, in some cases, and that was its own kind of weight, with Earth's formal acknowledgement attached. Var did not leave with the other delegations. Reyes had asked him to stay briefly before the ships departed. He had said yes. He stayed on Earth for 3 more days. Those 3 days were not in the formal record of the signing. They did not produce any additional documents or agreements. They were, in the accounting of galactic politics, irrelevant. Reyes took him through the operations center he had not seen on his first visit. She took him to the Deep Space Relay Network and explained its structure. Not all of it, still, but more than she had shown anyone else. More than was technically necessary. She showed him the agricultural systems. She showed him the medical research, the databases of species-specific medicine that Earth's researchers had been building for 3 centuries in the between, one species at a time, on the grounds that when they came back, they intended to be useful. There was a database entry for every species in the remnant assembly. He stood in front of the Darathi entry and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "We started these before we knew who would survive," Reyes said, standing beside him. "We built them for everyone who was here when we left. We just kept building them, in case." He looked at the Darathi medical database. It was comprehensive in a way that his people's own medical records, patchy and incomplete after 3 centuries of disruption, were not. It contained treatments for conditions that the Darathi medical community had been trying to address for decades, with inadequate resources. It contained things that the 40,000 people who had died in the famine 11 years ago might have needed. He did not say this out loud. She already knew. "We know we weren't here," she said. "That will always be true. We know what happened while we were gone, and we know that we weren't here for it." She was looking at the database, not at him. "We're going to have to live with that. That's part of what we came back carrying." A pause. "But we're here now, and the database is here, and it belongs to your people from today." He put his hand briefly on the console. He did not know why. It felt like the right thing to do. On the morning of the 3rd day, Reyes drove him in an open vehicle through the countryside outside the operations center. This was not a scheduled activity. She had simply appeared at his guest quarters in the early morning and said, "Come and see something." He came. The countryside was the specific green of places that have been left alone long enough to remember what they are. The road was narrow. The sky above it was the deep, unprocessed blue he had noticed on approach and had not stopped noticing. A color that was different from the sky on every industrialized world he had visited. Different in a way that was difficult to name but unmistakable. She stopped the vehicle on a ridge above a long valley. The valley was full of, in a way that no valley on any world Var regularly visited was full of life. Not just crops or managed growth, but the layered complex of things growing where they chose to grow. Tall trees and lower growth, and the movement of animals in the middle distance, and birds overhead in patterns that served nothing but themselves. "We had a rule," Reyes said, looking at the valley. "In the between, one of the first ones we agreed on, before we agreed on much else. Whatever we built in there, the research, the infrastructure, the expansion, we were going to do it carefully. We were going to keep asking, what are we doing this for?" She rested her arms on the doorframe of the vehicle. "Because it's easy to build for the sake of building. It's easy to expand for the sake of expanding. We'd seen what that looked like." She glanced at him. "From the outside before we left. And we didn't want to come back and be that." Var looked at the valley. The rule was before any project, any construction, any expansion of any kind, you had to be able to answer one question clearly. She paused. "Who is this for?" He let that sit. Below the ridge, something moved in the long grass at the valley's edge. Large, unhurried, paying no attention to the vehicle or the 2 beings sitting in it. An animal that had not learned to be afraid of things on ridges because things on ridges had not, in this animal's experience, threat. You asked Heth that question, Var said. In the private room, I asked him what he was building for, she said. Yes. What did he say? She was quiet for a moment. He said he was building for permanence, for the Keth, for the future of his species in the galaxy. She watched the animal in the grass below, and I said, we understand that. We want your species to have a future in the galaxy. We want every species to have a future in this galaxy. Another pause. And I asked him whether permanence built on what he had built it on was actually permanent, or whether it was just deferred collapse. Var looked at her. What did he say to that? He was quiet for a long time, she said. And then he said that the question was worth sitting with. She looked back at the valley. He's a smart being. He's done terrible things with that intelligence. But he's smart. She said this without warmth and without hatred, in the same plain tone she used for everything. Smart enough to recognize a true thing when it's put to him directly. You think he'll honor the framework. I think he'll honor the parts that aren't too costly, she said. And I think when the parts that are costly come up, we'll need to be present. She turned the vehicle back on. That's what the next 30 years look like. Presence, consistency. Holding the line on the things the line needs to be held on. She looked at him. We're going to need good people on the assembly side. People who know how to navigate the politics without losing sight of what the politics are for. He understood what she was saying. He looked at the valley one last time. The animal had moved deeper into the grass and was no longer visible. 40 years, he said. I have been doing this for 40 years. I know, she said. I'm old. I know that too. He looked at her. You're also the only person in the remnant assembly who has the full institutional memory, the political relationships with all three empires, and the specific kind of stubbornness that doesn't look like stubbornness from the outside, she said. It was not flattery. It was an assessment delivered plainly. We need that in the oversight body, for as long as you're willing. He looked at the sky, the blue sky, the unprocessed blue of a world that had been given time and had used it well. My grandmother would have found this very satisfying, he said. Rhea smiled, the small honest kind, the only kind she seemed to have. Tell me about her, she said. On the drive back, he told her. 6 months after the signing, a Dorothy girl named Sally stood in a field on a world her people had been returned to. She was 9 years old. The field had been farmland before the displacement, and it was going to be farmland again. And right now it was tall, dry grass that reached her shoulders and moved when the wind pushed through it. Her mother was in the village a kilometer behind her, working on the preliminary soil surveys. Her older brother was helping with the equipment setup. Her job, because she was 9, and this was how 9-year-olds helped on survey days, was to stay out of the way, which she was doing by walking into the field until the grass was taller than she was, and sitting down. She lay on her back and looked at the sky. She knew about the compact. Her mother had explained it, and her teachers had explained it before that, and she had read the summary documents in the school files because she was the kind of child who read things that were not assigned. She knew the word between and what it meant. She knew about Commander Reyes and Senator Var, and the framework and the 30-year implementation timeline. She knew that this world, this field, this grass, this sky, was supposed to have been theirs all along, and was now theirs again, and that this had happened because something very old and very far away had come back. The sky above her was darkening at the edges as the sun moved. The first stars were appearing. She knew their names. Her teacher had taught them, the Dorothy names and the old human names both, because the school had a new curriculum since the compact, one that included Earth's records of the sky, which were very old and very detailed and now freely available to anyone who wanted them. And there was the other light, the one that was not a star, steady and fixed in a specific position above the eastern horizon, unblinking in the way of something placed deliberately rather than something burning. An Earth relay station, one of dozens now in this system, threaded into the network that ran from here outward in all directions, connecting this world to others and those to others, all the way back to the blue-green planet that had come home. Sally had asked her mother once what the relay stations actually did, beyond connecting communications. Her mother had thought about it for a moment and then said, "They mean we're not alone anymore." Sally had thought about this answer for a long time. She was still thinking about it, lying in the tall grass, watching the relay station's steady light. The galaxy she was going to grow up in was not the one her parents had grown up in. She understood this in the way children understand large things. Not fully, not with all the weight of it, but truly in a way that would only grow heavier and more real as she grew into it. She understood that something had been wrong for a very long time. and that someone had gone away and come back and done something about the wrong thing, and that it was going to take a long time for the doing to finish, and that she was going to be alive for a lot of that time. She reached up her hand into the air above her. She pointed at the relay station light. She held that position for a moment, arm extended, one finger pointing at the small, steady point of a humanity that had been gone for 1,000 years, and had come back carrying everything it had made of the time. She had a word for it now, a word her teacher had taught her from the Earth records, an old human word for the feeling of a thing that has been lost coming back. Return. She said it quietly, to the sky, to nobody, to the grass moving around her. Return. The relay station held its position. The stars came fully out. The field breathed in the slow way of fields that have been allowed to be fields, unhurried and ordinary and, after everything, still here. Sally put her arm down. She got up and walked back through the tall grass toward the lights of the village, toward her mother and the survey work and the smell of food, and all the ordinary things that ordinary evenings were made of on worlds that had been given back to the people they belonged to. Behind her, the sky held everything. Stars old and new, the light of the relay station, the particular dark of a horizon that would be bright with sunrise in a few hours, the same sun that had risen on this world since before anyone was there to see it, and would rise again tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as long as the world turned. The galaxy was different now, not fixed, not finished, not without the long, hard work that Reyes had described on the ridge, the 30 years of presence and consistency and holding lines that needed holding, but different. The kind of different that starts in one place and spreads outward slowly and cannot be undone, the way a root cannot be undone once it has grown deep enough into the ground. Humanity had come home, and it had brought the difference with it, and somewhere on a blue-green world spinning in the light of its yellow star, surrounded by 412 systems of carefully built infrastructure and 3 centuries of accumulated research and the long patient record of a species that had decided to do something very hard and then done it. People went about their evenings, ordinary evenings, the same ones they had been having in the between for 1,000 years, the same ones they would keep having now that they were back. And the lights of their world were the kind of lights that a healthy world makes. Not too bright, not burning anything it didn't need to burn. They were home. They had always been going to come home. The only question had been what they would bring with them when they did.